Hi everyone. Today I want to tell the story of a man named Lot. Lot was an ordinary guy. He had a relationship with God, but he wasn't like one of those super Christians. He was more like an average Christian, an average religious person. Now, Lot knew somebody who was like a super Christian. He had an uncle named Abraham, and Abraham was this towering figure of faith. We've been learning about Abraham for the past few weeks. You might have heard about the time that God told Abraham to sacrifice his only son. I mean, it turns out it was only a test from God because God actually hates human sacrifice. But Abraham didn't know it at the time because we're so early in the Bible. And so Abraham trusted God so much that he was willing to sacrifice his only son whom he loved, which is crazy because I have 2 kids of my own and I love my children. I can't imagine killing my own child. Unless, of course, they're being super annoying, in which case I can totally imagine killing, but that's besides the point. In the case of Abraham, it wasn't because his kid was annoying. It was because God told him. And it was a test of faith that really showed everyone how strong Abraham's faith was. Abraham's like one of those great heroes of the Bible. But then in this whole Abraham narrative, the Bible takes a whole chapter to interrupt the Abraham story. And all of a sudden, we start reading about Abraham's nephew, Lot. And Lot is like the mini version, the light version of Abraham. Lot is like Diet Coke compared to your regular Coke. Or it's like your average high school student compared to the straight A guy who's gunning for med school. And in a way, it's a bit easier to relate to Lot because he's more average. He's more like the typical person at church. Except as it turns out, he had a pretty crazy story. And I'll tell you this story, which we find in Genesis chapter 19. The story tells us that one day Lot was sitting at the city gate of his town. The city gate was like City Hall back then, and the way Lot is introduced to us, it implies that he was a man of standing and status and wealth, and he had a position at the City Hall. One evening, there were 2 guests who showed up at the gate, and Lot could tell right away that these were visitors. And just like any good Middle Eastern man at that time, Lot extended this generous hospitality to these guests. He invited these men into his home, urged them to eat dinner with him, spend the night at his place so they didn't have to sleep outside. Very considerate. And these visitors accepted his hospitality. So that night they were eating dinner together at Lot's house. But while they were eating, suddenly their house was surrounded by all the men of the city. Everybody, young and old. They had heard that there were these 2 guests who had come into town. And the whole mob had come to sexually assault these guests. There's no nice way to put it. It was a mob of rapists. And everyone in town was in on this. Well, that went from 0 to 100 pretty fast, eh? So Lot went outside and he tried to reason with this crowd. And he tried desperately to bargain with these people, but they didn't listen. And these people in the crowd, they moved towards his door to start breaking it down. And if this story isn't weird enough, here's where it gets even more weird. Because these guests inside the house, they weren't just ordinary guys, but they were angels in disguise. And these angels had been sent by God on a mission because they had heard of how evil the city was. And their mission of these angels was to actually see the evil for themselves, to see if the city needed to be destroyed. And now it was quite plain. When they saw this crowd, it was clear that this city was completely deserving of judgment because the whole town had come to do this to innocent guests. And as the mob closed in to break down the door, these angels used their powers to strike down the crowd with blindness. The angels told Lot to gather his family, get out of town because they were going to destroy this whole place. I mean, who says the Bible is boring, man? This is wild. And now we come to our main Bible passage. It's Genesis chapter 19, starting at verse 15. says, with the coming of dawn, the angels urged Lot, saying, hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished. When he hesitated, the men grasped his hand and the hands of his wife and of his 2 daughters, and led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. As soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, flee for your lives, don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away. Skip to verse 23. By the time Lot reached Zoar, the sun had set over the land, or risen over the land. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. That's our Bible story. You know, as strange as the story sounds, it actually has a really big lesson to teach us. Important lesson. The lesson is about how to avoid spiritual disaster. And by spiritual disaster, I mean the kind of trouble that comes from a broken relationship with God. A lot of trouble in life comes from sin that can cripple a person's life. And other times, trouble comes in the form of lostness, where it just feels like you're just drifting forever through life. And some of us are in that trouble right now, and for others of us, we feel like we're doing fine spiritually, but we're never really far away from spiritual disaster. So I think it's quite appropriate that this week and the next week we'll be diving deep into the story of Lot, and he'll teach us about disaster management. Our passage today gives us the first 2 keys for avoiding disaster. The first, we need commitment. The second, we need ambition. I'll talk first about commitment. And by commitment, I mean the willingness to pay a price. In our story, the angels asked for a ton of commitment from Lot. They asked him to leave his city, leave the people that he knew and loved, leave behind his wealth and his status, leave behind his social network, his whole lifestyle. And he'd have to leave his whole town, leave it all behind with just the clothes on his back and the lives of his family members. But otherwise he was a homeless man. And so you can imagine his feeling of shock. And the angels told him that this whole city was about to be destroyed. And Lot and his family just had to flee to the mountains. And Lot was just overwhelmed by the sense of loss. He was so frozen by how big this loss was. The angels just had to take him by the hand like a little child and lead him out of the city. And we're meant to feel sorry for this guy. But we're also meant to relate as well. Because as it turns out, all of us have to go through a loss like this. Every Christian has to have a moment where we decide that we're going to have to give up all of our rights for Jesus and do whatever Jesus tells us to do, even if it costs us everything. For me, one of the most defining moments of my life was the time I was switching careers. My first job out of university was in the engineering and construction industry. And I liked my job quite a bit. It was interesting, paid well, it was comfortable. It's a job where I can just work my shift and then leave it behind, go home, play video games, have fun. I could still volunteer at church, which I loved. And I was dating a girl at that time. And the girl and I were pretty serious, and I was thinking of marrying her. She didn't want me to be a pastor because she had an idea what that lifestyle was like, and she wasn't the only one who didn't like my plan. My mom didn't want me to be a pastor either. My coworkers thought it was a bad idea. But I knew I had to go. I knew it because of all the principles that we talk about at this church. All these themes in the Bible of love and joy and mission and wisdom, they were all pointing to me switching careers. And it's not like everybody needs to become a pastor in order to follow God. Far from it. In fact, last time a young man talked to me about becoming a pastor, I talked him out of it because it's not for everybody. But I could see at that point that God had been training me for my entire life to do the work that I do now. I knew that it was time to go. So I left my job, went back to school. Suddenly I had no income. The move back to school strained my relationship so much that we broke up. But God took care of me. I started dating another girl that I liked. We got married. So I have a good marriage now, and I also have my dream job. I can see now that if I hadn't followed God's direction and left everything behind, it would have been the biggest mistake of my life. Like if I had stayed in that relationship, in that first career, I would have slowly died inside. As it turns out, there was only one way for me. There was no light version of following Jesus. It was everything or it was nothing. And I wish I could tell you that there was a light version of Christianity. I wish I could tell you that you don't have to become like Mother Teresa, like those super Christians. I wish it was just about extra credit and the rest of us are fine. I wish I could tell you that you can just believe a few things and not just try not to mess up too bad. And you can have the kind of relationship with God where God is just helping you to fulfill your worldly dreams, and you can just be popular and healthy and wealthy and successful and have fun and have a great family life. Basically the same kind of dream that anybody would have if they didn't know Jesus. And now that you know Jesus, you can just add heaven at the end. I wish I could tell you that that was a viable option. But everything in the Bible tells me that if you cling on to the ordinary life that makes sense in our culture, you'll lose it all. It'll slowly kill your soul. But if you give up your right to an ordinary life, God will provide for you. And more often than not, you'll find that God's plan was way better than yours, even from an earthly point of view. So getting practical now. I want you to explore a question. It's a question that's so important. It's so important not just for yourself, but also for the people you influence. My question is 100% commitment absolutely necessary? As in, do you really have to give up everything to avoid a spiritual disaster? And you already know my answer, and I'll continue to live it out in front of you. But this question is so important that you would do well not to just take my word for it. I want you to see it for yourself. See it in the Bible. Talk about it in Bible study. Debate it with Christian friends. Look for solid answers that will stand up to scrutiny, because this is the kind of question that can save you from disaster. And that wraps up my first point. The first key to avoiding disaster is commitment. Moving on, the second key to avoiding disaster is ambition. I'm talking about a drive towards the things of God. In verse 17 of our passage, the angels give some really specific instructions to the family. The angels tell them to head for the mountains and not look back. But the end of our passage tells us that Lot's wife looked back, and as a result, she was turned into a pillar of salt. It's natural to ask, what's so bad about looking back? My answer is, the way we look at things says a lot about what we're thinking. I remember one time I was watching a video made by a professional poker player. He was explaining the game to beginners, and poker is, of course, a game of cards. You don't get to see the other person's cards, but you're trying to figure out what they have so you can bet against them. And a big part of the game is reading the people around you and seeing what clues they give, because they're always giving out little bits of information about what they have. And this pro player says that one of the best clues you can get when a person looks at their cards for the first time is if they look at their cards and they immediately look at their chips real quick, that could be a real sign that they have something in their hand that's pretty good. Because this quick glance, it could be really subconscious. This quick glance at the card tells us they're thinking, how much can I bet? And they ask that question if their cards are strong. And so if they do that quick glance, be careful. And you can tell what a person is thinking about just by the way they move their eyes, just seeing what they're looking at. You can also watch what a person doesn't look at. Completely different story. I remember one time I was a kid in elementary school. My friends and I used to play this prank. You've probably seen it before. We'd come up beside a person and we'd tap them on the opposite shoulder. They would look the other way and we'd get a good laugh. And my friends and I would do that to each other all the time. But in our class, there was a boy with a severe mental disability. And don't judge me, okay? I was a bad kid. My friends were like, hey, we should tap that guy on the shoulder. So I went up beside the kid with a mental disability and I tapped him on the opposite shoulder. I got nothing. The kid looked forward like nothing had happened. Nobody had touched him at all. It was like he didn't even think about who was tapping on his shoulder. And I think we can bring that kind of understanding into our Bible story. Because I think the angels, in a way, were telling the family to be a bit like the disabled boy. The angels were saying, don't think about what's behind you. Don't think about it at all. Don't wish that you got that lifestyle back. Because that lifestyle is cursed. Your thinking has to be forward. You have to think about the place you're going. You have to use your mind to figure out this new way of life that God has put you into. Think about how you'll live out your choice to leave out everything behind. Think about your choice to go to the mountains. And it's so important for them to look forward and not back. You know, if Lot's wife had considered looking forward and committed herself to the plan of God, she would have seen that it wasn't as bad as it first looked. I mean, sure, they lost everything. Sure, the unknown was scary, but it wasn't hopeless. Not at all. They would have quickly remembered that they had a relative named Abraham. And Abraham loved them, and Abraham was super rich. And Abraham would have taken them in for sure. And even before they got to Abraham, they would have been okay. Because God had made a point to save their lives. And if God cared enough to save them, it would make no sense for God to just let them die the next day. So God would provide for them too. And had this family applied their minds to God's plan and thought forward, they would have seen hope and security even in the darkest moment of their life. But instead, Lot's wife looked back, and she turned into a pillar of salt. And it's worth asking, why salt of all things? Why not pepper? Why not soy sauce? Oh, we find our answer later in the Bible in Deuteronomy chapter 29. As the Bible describes a cursed land full of salt and sulfur, just like the land that the angels had destroyed in our story. And Deuteronomy 29 talks about a land that was unproductive and useless because of the salt and the sulfur, because that's what happens when there's too much salt content in the soil. And it happens in nature sometimes when a patch of soil is next to some salty minerals, and the salt seeps into the soil and it changes the soil and prevents anything from growing. You know, soil is good. It was prized in the Middle East. But salted land was useless. And the point of Lot's wife turning into salt was to say to everybody that her heart was like unproductive soil. It was full of the wrong things. She had been longing for a forbidden lifestyle, and that longing prevented her from doing anything useful in life. And she had turned into a liability not only for herself, but also for the people around her. And so, God in His wisdom just ended her life early. And the story of Lot's wife is a reminder to us to be careful about our ideas and our ambitions and our dreams. Because if you have the wrong dream, it will cripple your life. If your big dream in life is the same as anybody would have, even if they had no relationship with God, it's the wrong dream. And it's dangerously wrong. But a Christian's ultimate dream has to be about the stuff of eternity. And we have to press into the plans of God. And if you do that, you'll find that God's plans are scary and there's a lot of sacrifice involved. But if you just look a little bit further, you'll find security and grace. And so we need to apply our minds fully to this lifestyle that God has shown us in the Bible. And that's ambition at its best. Sometimes I think about my baby Pascal. He's 10 months old now. I look at him sometimes and I'd say I'd like him to be a pastor one day, and I can train him up in Hebrew and Greek so he can read the Bible super accurately. He'd annoy all of his Sunday school teachers. But Pauline said to me, no, if he's really smart, he'll go into business and make a ton of money and he'll fund 100 pastors. I thought, oh, that's better. You know, it's good to have conversations like that. Like, even if he's never a pastor or he never becomes a businessman, it's healthy to talk about big dreams and even scary dreams that make sense within your relationship with God. For me, I have a dream that this church will be so strong and so good that it becomes a resource to churches all across Canada, and we can all start working together. And to some extent, it's already happening, and it's really exciting. And each of us has to cultivate dreams like that. Dreams that make sense in God's plan for us. We need to talk about what we could potentially achieve. Perhaps you could set a goal that maybe you could help 10 people over the course of your lifetime to find faith, find Jesus. I think it's actually very achievable. If you put your mind to it and you equip yourself, it's quite achievable. It's not like you get everything you dream about, but if you are ambitious, you might be surprised at how much you do achieve. And so let's keep our eyes forward on God's plan for us. Let's be ambitious, because a good ambition will keep you productive and it'll keep you out of trouble as well. So that's the second key to avoiding spiritual disaster, is ambition. I'll conclude by summarizing everything I've said, and then I'll pray for us. So in summary, the Bible story teaches us 2 keys to avoiding disasters. The first key is commitment. The story of Lot reminds us that God's way costs us everything, and there's no light option for the Christian life. But if we would commit fully to God's plan for us, we'll find grace and security even in our darkest moments. And I encourage you not just to take my word for it, but investigate this. See it for yourself that it's true, because it's so important to understand this, that there is no middle ground, that there is no halfway with Jesus. But those who go with him all the way will be blessed. The second key to avoiding a disaster is ambition. To have eyes forward into God's plan for us. To commit to making the most of the lifestyle that God wants you to live. To dream of things that make sense in eternity. So I encourage you, let's talk about big ideas and big dreams. You'll probably be surprised at how powerful and accomplished you can be if you put your mind to it. And I expect if you do these things, you'll not just survive, but you'll thrive. You'll live life as God intended, life to the full as Jesus talked about. You'll have all that you need. God's plan will bring you to life, just as it did for me. Let's close in prayer. God, your way is good. It's just so costly. But you have shown yourself to be trustworthy. And you have shown us that when we follow you, you will take care of us. Help us to find the truth about you. And also we ask that you give us those dreams, those big ambitions in our hearts. Place them in our heart and fulfill them for your glory and for our joy. Amen.